Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Kristen Kirkwood, the Executive Director of the Harford Land Trust, and I am so delighted to have so many of you on this evening. This workshop series, which this is the first presentation as part of it, was really born out of two different things. First was our recognition in Harford County that many landowners or people just involved with managing woodlands or simply just interested in woodlands didn't know all of the resources available to them or all of the information at their fingertips from some of our great partners in the Chesapeake area. And we oftentimes will get questions from people around how could they learn more or how could they do more on the properties that they have a purview over. Oh, Cassie, if you could mute yourself, you just joined, thanks. Oh, Miss Jasmine, I can do it for you. There we go. The second thing was a partnership with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. For anyone that's not familiar with the Alliance, Craig will tell you a little bit more in a moment, but they're one of the premier partners in this Chesapeake region around watershed and forest issues. And they put out wonderful educational material related to forests and woodlands. And so in our discussions with Craig and others there, we learned about these great programs that they had rolled out and thought we need to bring this to Harford County. And the third thing is a wonderful grant program that's administered by the Chesapeake Bay Trust to help with programs just like this. And Harford County put some funding into that recently, which brought more of that grant funding to Harford County. So again, I just want to welcome everyone this evening to the first in this series called Woods in Your Backyard. Just a brief introduction on the Harford Land Trust before I turn it over to Jackie and Craig. So Harford Land Trust is a nonprofit based solely in Harford County. This is our 30th anniversary, so we've been around for some time. And our mission has been for that entire 30 years and still is the preservation of open space in Harford County. And that is both woodland as well as farms, wetlands, and other valuable natural resources. We do that in a variety of ways, most of which is working with private landowners to understand the conservation values of their land and what their goals are, and then seeing what tools we can bring to bear to preserve that land. And we've created a lot of parkland in Harford County, but also preserved a lot of private land. So we continue to be the go-to partner for any sorts of land preservation across the county. But increasingly, our role is in disseminating information about land use, about development, about conservation, and just about practices that landowners can do on their own properties. So again, this is sort of in that educational component, but if you do have any questions after this at all related to the rest of our work, please do reach out to Jackie or myself, and we'd be delighted to answer you. And I do see a lot of our members on this meeting tonight, but also if you are not a member of the Harford Land Trust, please do check out our website. We have a lot of resources, and all of the things we do depend on the generosity of people like you in this community. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jackie Kane, who is our land manager at the Harford Land Trust.
Thanks, Kristen. Yes, as Kristen said, we have, hold on one second, I'm driving and there are too many buttons going on. There we go. As Kristen mentioned, that I'm the land manager, and I've had the privilege of working with Craig and Kristen on getting this project to you all. This is the first series of 4 workshops that we'll be putting on in partnership with the Alliance for the Bay. Our next one that's coming up on October 29th is at Stony Forest. It is a project that is near and dear to Kristen and my heart, as we were a part of lending a hand and having it preserved permanently this past year. That's about 950 acres of woodland forest that will no longer be developed. So we're very proud of that, and we're very proud to be able to share this with you guys and have you have the ability to walk through it. After that, we will take people to the Susquehanna Wildlife Society in Darlington, where we will talk about invasive species management, what works, what doesn't work, and what you guys can maybe implement at your own home. And then our last session will be another virtual session where we will talk about the benefits of having woods on your property. All of these events are free, just as this one is tonight. We do require registration. It helps with the 3 of us to make sure that we have the proper materials for everybody. And for those in-person events, we're making sure that we are at a capacity that everyone feels comfortable with and that the venues can withstand. So if you guys have any questions about what the event is, if there will be any changes, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, you can register for these events on our website by going to our events page and then clicking on the October to November Forest Program Workshop. It's very similar to how we registered everyone for tonight. You will receive email confirmations and all follow-up information through us. So I will put this next slide on for now, but we will surely revisit it at the end. This is everyone who will be speaking tonight. Craig from the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, Kristen Kirkwood, and myself. If you guys need to get in touch with us or would like to ask more information, I encourage you to do so. Feel free to email us at any time. And we will do our best to get back to you in a timely manner. So in the chat feature, I will say if you guys want to just introduce yourself by typing, who you are, where you are in the county, and maybe how big of a wooded property or woodland area that you're interested in or concerns about. I'm going to leave the formal introductions to get to know each other a little bit better in person on Saturday, just because we have more time to do so. And speaking of Saturday, you guys will be receiving a follow-up email from us tomorrow, just to confirm the location at Harford Glen, what you can expect and what you need to bring as participants. I will say it is a rain or shine event, so please dress appropriately for the outdoors. But with that, Craig, I will pass it along to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity, first to work with Harford Land Trust, but to present to you all about woodlands. So it's funny, I've been at the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay for since 2007. So it's been a while. If you haven't heard of the Alliance, we're a small nonprofit, but we have offices in Annapolis and Richmond, Virginia, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Washington, DC. So kind of our goal is to bring people together to solve problems focused on the Chesapeake Bay and water quality. I'm the director of their forest program. So, we concentrate on the forest and working with private forest landowners. So we really do three things. One is education and outreach to private woodland owners. And that was kind of our main thrust. And that's kind of why I'm here tonight. We also do reforestation on private land. So we plant a lot of trees in all those states. And then we also help landowners with existing forest land, so how to promote sustainable forest management.
Hey Craig, do you mind putting your video on just so people can see you as well?
Oh, sure.
Great.
Hey, everyone. I'll probably turn it off when I present. I tend to distract with how old I look. All right, so I'll share my screen. Does that work, Jackie? Stop screen.
And while Craig's getting set up, if anyone has any particular question that you have, whether or not we're going to answer it today, we'll make sure that we get those cataloged and we answer those things on Saturdays and get you the right material as well. Please go ahead and type that in the chat.
Didn't do that right. Hold on here. I think I'd have this down. All right. Let me try that again. Sorry about this. Okay, can everyone see that? I mean, okay, good. So tonight we're actually going to do a program called Woods in Your Backyard, and it's a great program. It's designed, it's kind of a do-it-yourself guide for private landowners to kind of take care of their woodland property or enhance or create new woodland on their property. So, in open fields, creating meadows. So it's kind of a do-it-yourself guide. So this program has been out for a long time. And like I said, I started with the Alliance in 2007. I first taught my first program, and I've done this all over the Bay watershed. I've taught in Pennsylvania, New York, West Virginia, Virginia, and Delaware. And the first time I offered this program was in 2008 in Harford County. So that was my first introduction to this. I tried it out there. It's nice to come full circle after doing this hundreds of these programs and come back to Harford. So I'm excited about the opportunity on Saturday as well. So let's see here. I seem to have this problem advancing my slides. Okay. So before we get into it, I kind of want to give you an overview of kind of why we're doing this program or what this program's about. And, you know, it really is about taking care of Maryland's woodlands. So Maryland's woodlands are pretty remarkable. You probably heard the expression, you know, Maryland is American miniature. So, and that's true. I mean, if you're out in Garrett County, you're up on that Appalachian Plateau, if you're traveling from Garrett County down to, say, Ocean City, I mean, think about what you're traveling over. You're going from the Appalachian Plateau, you're hitting kind of the Ridge and Valley, over the Blue Ridge Mountains, into the Piedmont, and then on the coastal plain. And then you go over to, you know, the Eastern Shore, and it's much flatter. It's still the coastal plain, but, you know, the topography and the land, everything changes as you move throughout this state in such a tiny area. Well, the great thing about that is our woodlands change as well. The same woods that you find out in Garrett and Allegheny County are going to be dramatically different than what you find over on the Eastern Shore. Everywhere you go, you're going to find, you know, different woodlands because the land is different. And so we have a lot of different forest types. So in Harford County, we have mainly kind of an oak hickory type forest. So you might have that on your property. There's going to be a lot of species, and we'll get into that, especially on Saturday, about what we can find in Harford County. But it just, everywhere you go, you're going to find differences within our forest. And that's really important because we do emphasize forests within our program. And the reason being is Maryland was a forest. You know, it was a forest longer than humans have been here. In fact, the entire East Coast at one time was a forest, a solid forest. You know, we have the correct climate and the soils for there to be forest on their land, as opposed as you start to go out west, you know, and then we, you know, reach the prairie and in the high desert. In the East, it is a forest. It's designed to be a forest. So the Chesapeake Bay watershed at one time was forested. Now this is where I'm kind of contractually obligated to mention the Chesapeake Bay. So I will at this point. The Chesapeake Bay watershed at one time was 95% forested. You know, there were some wetlands and a lot of forests. So if you think about it, that is a lot of forest land. Now, what makes the Chesapeake Bay so unique is half of that water in the bay is fresh water compared to other bays. That's really odd. You know, most other bays are highly influenced by the ocean. You have a lot more salt water, but half of the water in the bay is fresh, and that's coming from the land. And at one time, that was actually coming from a forest. So everything in the bay kind of adapted at one point from the water that flowed through a forest. But what makes forests so unique is what happens when water hits the land. So that fresh water, before it gets into our streams, comes from the rain and it hits our forested land. Now, what happens is a majority of that water is going to infiltrate down into the ground, becomes part of groundwater. You know, half of it during the growing season, 45% of it actually is pulled up by the forest and transpired into the atmosphere. There's very, very little runoff coming out of a forest. And so kind of what that creates is, you know, is water that would go into our stream was highly influenced by our forest land. You know, the high organic materials within our forest soils and the minerals went into our streams and actually would kind of feed the food chain all the way down to the Chesapeake. But the thing about groundwater compared to runoff, as it goes into the groundwater, that water takes days to weeks to months to years ever to make it to a stream. So that's why you'd have periods without rain. You have groundwater constantly filling up our streams, nice cool groundwater. And so, you know, I like to think, well, you know, the fact that we can start charting the woes of the bay and our water quality to kind of the loss of forest land. And so as, you know, we settled this land, as Europeans arrived, the amount of forest cover dropped. And, you know, we cleared land for agriculture mainly, but our cities, and we expanded, and we lost a lot of forests. We actually have more forests now than we did at 1900. There's more forests on the land. So the idea is we expanded throughout the Bay watershed, throughout Maryland, cleared the land for agriculture. And then, you know, as people, in the Industrial Revolution, as people left the farms to go into the cities to work in factories, a lot of that agricultural land was left to go fallow. And like I said, Maryland is a forest. So what happens is a forest reemerged on a lot of our land. So probably if you have woodlands, that's only there because it grew back from a forest land. That it was agricultural probably at one time. There's very little areas in Maryland that actually had started with forest and still had it. Most of it was cleared for agriculture. So you can date a lot of your forests to the same year as when that land was abandoned. And forests grew back on it. So a lot of our forests are of similar ages, between 80 and 110 years old, or what most of our forests are. Now, if you've had forest harvest done, if there's been harvesting done on the property, that kind of changes the ages of the trees within that parcel. But a lot of our forests are of similar age here in Maryland. And there's something very unique about the forest land ownership. And this is kind of the reason why this program was developed, is to help reach smaller acreage landowners. Now, a majority of our forests in the East are privately owned. In the Chesapeake Bay watershed, 80% of the forest that you see when you're driving throughout the Bay watershed is privately owned. We have very little public forest compared to the private forest land. But what's unique about a lot of that forest land is, we have a lot of forest landowners. And you can see kind of on this chart, and this is a dated chart, but it still rings true. We still have a lot of really large privately owned parcels. I mean, that's, a majority of our forests. But as you start to move to the left on this chart, you can see a vast amount of forest landowners within the Bay watershed own less than 10 acres of forest. Okay, so that's a majority of our forest landowners own less than 10 acres. The reason why this is important, well, our land, just through generations, it gets divided, it gets parcelized. If you think, you have a piece of property, it's sent down to the next generation, often it gets parcelized. So it gets divided up under ownership. So that's what parcelization is. What we're seeing though is fragmentation as well. So you have a large portion of forested acres, it's divided up. We start developing portions of that, and that's what is called fragmentation. So you'll have that property, these large forests is just a graphic representation. And then what happens? We start to develop into what is called fragmented forest. And so what the issues with that are, and this is kind of what we're trying to address in the program, is there's fragmented forests out there. The effects on that is one thing for habitat. It isolates habitats. So if you think about like even that forested landscape for wildlife, or even for plants to be able to migrate and blow into new areas, you're limited. So a lot smaller parcels of forest, so you can have wildlife separated, especially ones that are within these forested blocks, may not be traveling between forest corridors. It increases edge. And what I mean by edge, and we'll look at this on Saturday, is when we fragment our forest, we create the amount of edge of that forest. Okay, if you have invasive plants on your property, most often in your forest land, it's going to be on the edge of that forest. It's kind of where it gets the most sunlight and that. So when you increase edge, you increase the vulnerability of that forest. And then, with fragmentations, you have a larger growing number of landowners. And what that does is decreases opportunities available to your landowners. So a lot of people owning small acres of land, it's tough for, a landowner who has small parcels to get a natural resource professional to visit their property to help them, like a forester. Or it's tough to take advantage of some of the, conservation programs out there as well, because these parcels are smaller and we're limited. But landowners are really the part of the solution, I think, to the Bay's woes, but just to forest health in general. And the reason being is there's lots of benefits that you probably all have for owning your property, things that you like about your property. Having woods increases your property values. There's a potential for forest products and recreational opportunities, or just peace and quiet, getting away from kind of the daily rigors of life. You probably have all reasons that you benefit from your forest, but knowing your land actually benefits the public. Most of our land is privately owned. Your woodland or your natural areas are doing the public good. So if you think about, that water that I talked about sinking into the ground, well, that's a benefit to everyone who enjoys, the Bay and our tributaries. Drinking water as well. A lot of people rely on surface water for the drinking water. Cleanest water comes out of forests. Be able to appreciate wildlife. So all this is coming off public land. So these private lands. So private woods are really doing the public good. So it's kind of the reason we wanted to reach out with this type of program. So people who are interested in doing stuff on their property, helping to take care of their own woodlands or creating new natural areas on their property. We want to bring them resources and help so you can do that, because in turn, your work does the public good. So kind of the goals of this program, and hopefully you've received the manual about this. So we're going to kind of base a lot of the stuff out of the manual. But the goal really of this is to help landowners, one is maintain and enhance existing woodlands. So if you have woodlands, part of this book, we're going to address that. How do you take care of them? How do you, increase their vitality? How do you have them help reach your goals? So your goals may be seeing more wildlife. Your goals may be hunting on that property, or, collecting things from that forest. With this book, it can help you, with this program, I should say, it help you kind of set goals for your property and then access resources to improve that. The second thing is we also are trying to help landowners create new natural areas on your lawn, or on your property. So a lot of that has to be with lawn conversion. And we get this a lot with our tree planting programs that we have. Is a lot of landowners are just motivated to plant trees on their property because they're tired of mowing their lawn. They might have this 4-acre lawn, 6-acre lawn that they're mowing every week, and it takes a lot of resources and they don't want to do it. So we want to teach you ways to create more natural areas. And that could be things like meadows. It could be, different types of wildlife gardens, or just individual tree plantings, or creating new forest on your property. So that's kind of the goals of this program. So the manual, and hopefully you get an opportunity to flip through it. This is really the guidebook. This is kind of the do-it-yourself. It's going to take you through everything you need to do. There's activities in there that will kind of help you along the way. But when you kind of finish this, the activities in the book, you're going to kind of have a plan on how you can reach your goals. So it's broken down into an overview. Part 2 is kind of the ecological principles. And that's what we're going to cover tonight, are the ecological principles, because everything is based on the ecology of the land, of your forest, and kind of working with your forest, with the ecology, rather than necessarily trying to control it. It just makes life easier. It makes your management more effective. Part 3 on this book is inventorying your property. Part 4 are land care practices. So it's actions you can take on your land to help reach your goals. And part 5 is kind of putting it all together. So we're going to cover part 3, 4, and 5 on Saturday. But this is an excellent resource. It has a lot of great appendices in it with good resources about different types of trees, preferences for wildlife, how to do some tree ID. It's just a great resource. And we'll connect you to some other resources after that. What's great about this is when this book was designed, is actually took a real family. They're not called the Nelsons. They changed their names, and they kind of work through this book on their own property. So it's actually one of the authors of this book, with his family, he worked through this book to help him manage his property. So, on all these activities, we give a scenario of the Nelsons, of what they decided. So you kind of see how this program works, how you can work through some of these activities and how it affects the outcomes. So it's helpful to have, I think, that scenario. All right, are there any questions right away? Because now we're going to kind of get into the ecology, the science of the basic principles that we're going to follow when you start doing some of these activities. All right, hearing.
Craig, I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but one person did say that they wanted to understand a little bit more about spotted lanternfly and probably other sorts of invasive pests on their land. as well as invasive species, such as tree of heaven, which I know that we'll get into in a different portion of this workshop, but no other
So, yeah, I mean, I'll answer any questions about that today. On Saturday, that's going to be one of our focal points, definitely invasive plants. We can discuss invasive insects, but a lot of that's going to be really looking at the property at Harford Glen as if it were just a private land. We're going to look at the woodlands, you know, what to look in there. And so we'll open that up to any kind of questions that you'll have. We'll do some tree ID. We'll do some invasive plant ID. We'll talk about invasive plant control. So we're going to do a whole plethora of things on Saturday that lends itself. But, you know, today, you know, I could definitely talk about any of those things as well. All right. And you may remember this from classes previous, but we're going to hit Forest Ecology 101, just kind of how your forest works. I think really understanding this sets up everything that you could do on your property. It's basically understanding how your woods work, or kind of how the land, you know, Maryland being a forest, how it kind of works. So I don't know about you, but you know, this is the best time of year to be in the forest. It's fall, starting to get cooler, and I pretty much guarantee everyone probably enjoys walking through the woods. You know, it's quite relaxing. You can kind of forget about your stresses, and you know, I can't tell anyone who's really doesn't like to just walk on a trail. But I think what that does, though, it creates a misrepresentation about what's happening in your forest as well. So, you know, you always hear this term, the balance of nature. Like, nature is in balance. You know, these trees, you know, are taking care of each other. The animals are taking care of everything. It's like a big living system that's all taking care of each other. But that's really not that true. If it was, that would be that picture right there of that northern red oak and that American beech would just be a loving embrace. And it's not. So what's really happening, or those trees are trying to kill each other. They are competing. Okay. Now, there are a few studies out there talking about mycorrhizal fungi and benefits from tree to tree, but in essence, trees compete. You know, vegetation competes, animals compete. And that's just what they do. These two trees are competing for light. They're competing for space. One's going to win ultimately, probably. One will top the other, and eventually one tree will decline. So, you know, it really is, if you think about your forest, you know, it's a war out there. And all you have to see is, you know, walk into your forest after a windstorm. There's all kind of branches down, and that's just from trees hitting each other. You know, they're blowing in the breeze, and it's just knocking out some of these trees. So some are at a disadvantage when they start to lose their foliage in their branches. But that's just naturally what happens. And the reason I say this is, you know, it is a war, and not necessarily this balanced system. It is our example here is, if you know this tree, this is the American chestnut tree. So, you know, at one time it was a dominant tree, especially in the mountains here in Maryland. It was the dominant tree in our forest. It was probably the most important tree in our forest for wildlife, for humans, in so many ways. The wood and the nuts that it produced. It was just such an invaluable, the flowers on it. It was an invaluable, most important tree species. One out of every 4 tree in the mountains, probably at one time, was a chestnut. And so, you know, if you know anything about the chestnut, what happened in the 1900s, 1800s, and then into the 1900s is the chestnut blight came through, and it's wiped them out. It's wiped them out of the East. Now they still survive, you know, as stump sprouts, but, you know, we essentially lost this really important tree from our forest. Now the forest didn't collapse. You would think if it was a balance of nature, the forest would just collapse, and it didn't. All it did was created more room for our oaks and our hickories to expand. And so he kind of filled that niche of, you know, the chestnut. And it'd be great to get the chestnut back, but somebody's going to fill that niche. And that's what, you know, our oak and hickory species did in a lot of our areas. So just created more room. So really in nature, in ecology, it's all about a term called fecundity. And that's really the ability for an organism, this is going to sound depressing when you think about nature, is just passing your genes to the next generation. You know, that's kind of the goal of what, you know, the wildlife and what the trees and the plants, they're passing their genes to the next generation in the form of seeds. And there's adaptation to do it. So, let's take a look at a couple of these pictures and the adaptations, different plants have in order to do this. For instance, like the grapevine on the top left-hand corner, it's adapted to really ride up to the top of that canopy, the tree canopy of that forest. It's getting a free ride. It doesn't have to build a big trunk, let's say like that beech tree. It doesn't need to do that. It just takes a free ride to the top, and there it can put out all its leaves, make its food, create its seed, and pass its genes to the next one. Say the black walnut. They have an adaptation too to try to outcompete everyone. They produce a toxin called juglone in the soil that it prevents certain plants from germinating or certain seeds from germinating around it. Oak trees on the bottom, you see that little sprout there. Their adaptation is they'll build a big root system first. They're a very slow growing tree, but what they're hoping for are gaps in the forest canopy, sort of like a fire coming through or the loss of the chestnut. So what they'll do is grow up as a small plant, and they build up their root reserves, and they get so big, and then they can't tolerate the shade and they die off. But the root systems keep growing, and they put up another shoot. And what they're waiting for is the canopy to open. As soon as there's a fire or a blowdown or a disease, they're ready to go with this big root system to kind of come in and dominate. The pileated woodpecker, their adaptations, they want to build their nest deep into the forest. So they're a forest interior dwelling species. And because they're trying to protect their brood from nest parasites, like on the right, top right hand corner is the brown-headed cowbird, which likes to make their nests, or they like to lay their eggs in other birds' nests right on the forest edge. So a pileated woodpecker will go deep into forest because they know the brown-headed cowbird won't go in there. So it's all about strategies for passing their genes on to the next generation. So when you think about it, they're competing. So within the forest, among the trees in there, who are those competitors and how do they compete? Well, what are they competing for first? It's really those three things that all plants need to survive. They need those three basic things. They need light, they need water, and they need nutrients. That's what a plant needs to do to make their food, and then they break down their food to grow. And so they're competing with other plants to do that. So within your forest, those trees are competing. And so your land provides those three things at different levels. That's called a site, is the conditions on your land. Now, let's say, in this greenhouse, let's say all our conditions on your land across Maryland, let's say we're the same thing. Let's say you had really nice, moist, well-drained soils. It's flat all over Maryland, and you had perfect climate. You would have like 2 to 3 trees in your forest, and that's it. It'd be those trees that would dominate. It'd be things like tulip poplar, which grows really fast. They would do well on those conditions. But the great thing about Maryland is, we have various types of soil, various topographies, different climates depending where you go. And so there's always different site conditions on your land for trees to compete. And so trees, just like those other animals, have special adaptations that help them compete with other trees. For instance, that beech, look at this beech here on the right. So their special adaptation is they can tolerate shade. A lot of trees like a black cherry can't tolerate shade. They need that open sunlight to grow. If it gets shaded over them, they die. Not the beech, American beech tree. It can tolerate, it grows very slow, but it's just biding its time underneath that canopy. It would grow perfectly well out in the open. As long as the soil conditions were perfect, it would grow to be as big as it can be, but it can't compete that way. It can't grow. So it needs to tolerate that shade. So it has an adaptation to do that. If you look at that tree in the middle, this is called a pitch pine. So a pitch pine would actually grow to be as big as it can be in a really well-drained mesic soil, really nice soil. It would be the biggest pitch pine it could be there, but you won't find them there. And the reason being is they can't compete with other trees in there. So you'll find them a lot of times on really dry mineral soils. And it's not because that's what they prefer, it's just they can outcompete trees there. And then bringing it to the last one. This is very unique to Maryland. This is the northernmost point for this tree, the bald cypress tree. And hopefully if you had the opportunity to see a bald cypress forest or a swamp, is a lot of times you'll see them growing in this just muck. You know, they grow well in there. They put up these little knees to get oxygen down their roots. It's an adaptation. Well, a bald cypress does well on that good soil, on that nice mesic soil. But they can't outcompete any tree to do that. So this is where you're going to find them. So think about this mountain. You know, this is like the great change in different site conditions as you go up that mountain. But think about the soils on the top of that mountain compared to the bottom of it. Think about the moisture. So it's dry, really thin soils on the top of the mountain compared to the bottom of the mountain, which will be a lot more moist, a lot more nutrients. And so the trees are going to differ there. So you might have, you know, chestnut oaks up on the top that can tolerate those kind of conditions. And we're down on the bottom, you know, you're going to get those things like black walnut and tulip poplar, which they grow really well, but they need those soils. The north side over here compared to the south side of that slope. Well, the afternoon sun, well, that's on the south side. The most intense part of the day, the sunlight is on this in the afternoon. So it's usually on that southwest facing slopes. Well, those soils are going to be drier. It gets more sunlight, but it's going to be much drier. So you're going to find different trees there as opposed to the north side of the slope. And this is kind of the last one. I'll go deep on this, but you can kind of see in this graph. This is from a basic forest ecology textbook. So let's look at these 4 species here: Virginia pine, northern red oak, tulip poplar, and white ash. You know, typical trees of our uplands area. So, you know, the curve kind of represents their growth. This is the volume that it grows here on the y-axis. The x-axis here are the types of soils. Hydric meaning really wet, mesic meaning moist, like perfect soil, and then xeric meaning very, very dry soils. So you can see where you can find, let's say, Virginia pine. It's not where it necessarily grows the best. It's going to grow best in those mesic, but it's outcompeted by everything else. So you would find it here more in the xeric soils because it can outcompete everything else. Nothing can tolerate that. And let's look at say the tulip poplar. You know, they grow very fast. It's a great tree, but they need those nice conditions. You're not going to find them down in the hydric soils, you know, along our waterways. And you're not going to find them up on the top of the mountains either. So everyone has kind of their niche of where they're going to succeed. You know, it's those adaptations. So thinking about that on your own land, if you look at the trees on your property, they're there for a reason. They've outcompeted other trees that were in there. They've succeeded. And, you know, we'll go through kind of the basic principles of forest succession. Like I said, on your property, it was one-time ag land. If you have forest land, it was still one-time ag land. You know, we let it go. I said, Maryland is a forest. A forest returned to the ag land, and it went through a series of predictable steps to get to be that forest. Okay, it's called forest succession. It's just a transition from one plant community into the next. Okay, and we'll kind of get into what those are. So, you know, it's kind of these pioneer species that will occupy the site first. If you just stop mowing your lawn, you know, your forest succession eventually would kind of take hold of it. So it's going from one plant community until you reach a climax community. So that's kind of the top. So what they're competing for in the east. So if you remember, light, water, and nutrients are the things that all plants are competing for. In the east, the one that's at a minimum is the one that's most vital, and that's light. Okay, so that's the one that runs out first, is light for these trees. So that's the one they're competing with the most. And so our forest succession is based on their competition for light. Everything else, soil, we have good soils for it, good soil nutrients, and you know, it rains a lot in the east compared to the west. So we have enough water as well, but they're competing for that light. So in that old field succession, if you can kind of see it, well, when I talk about it, it's like an ag field. As soon as it's abandoned, you know, there's a predictable pattern of vegetation that's going to take hold. First, it's going to be those light seeds that blow in. You know, it's going to be annual plants, annual grasses and forbs. But eventually what you're going to have are perennial grasses and forbs that start to take hold. They'll grow slower than those annuals, but eventually they'll take hold and they'll outcompete those annuals. They'll shade them out. Eventually what you're going to get are woody type plants in it. So you'll get, it could be, you know, raspberry, blackberries, sumac, things are going to grow really fast, but they're kind of woody vegetation. Red cedar is another one that you'll find early succession, and that'll take hold on that area. Eventually you're going to start to get some of these longer lived trees that are growing much slower, but there might be a little bit of tolerance of some shade. So eventually they'll take hold of the site. And then eventually you're going to get trees that can tolerate shade that are going to come up through it. They grow very slow until you kind of reach that climax. So that species that take a while to go, and that could be 100 years before you hit a climax in succession. So let me just show you kind of an example of this ag field. This is down in North Carolina, but great pictures. So ag field, let go fallow. You know, first you're going to get it occupied, those annual grasses. You'll get some perennials in there as well. And eventually you'll start to get the forbs in there and red cedar. In this particular case, there's other trees that could occupy it. You know, we'll get into invasives because that could occupy it as well anymore. But this is kind of a typical old field succession. You have red cedar in there, which grows fast, but it needs open sunlight, cannot tolerate shade at all. And then eventually you start to get hardwoods in here. You can see all the cedars in here, but you can start to see these hardwood trees rolling in here as well. And they're growing slower than the cedar, but they are growing right next to it. I mean, look what happened to the grass and all those forbs. It's occupied now by trees. Okay, so it shaded those out, those early successional species. You can see now here are the cedars. You have hardwood trees coming in. Eventually you get to a point where those hardwoods will top the cedar. So as soon as they top those species that don't tolerate the shade, those die out. So they were in a period for, you know, a short period of time. It could be 20 years, it could be 30 years. There's a lot of variables on that, but eventually that forest is going to start to top that. And then lastly, once you start to get, you know, that canopies close, the trees are going to be thinning out, you're going to start to get that forest understory plants. So you get things like that spice bush and viburnums, and you can get trilliums, you know, things that it take a while to establish, but they're what you would find in kind of a maturing forest. So that forest understory, things that will never be part of the canopy, but they kind of exist happy in that understory. And so, you know, you talk about that climax. And so we don't really have that. That's not a set point. So, you know, when humans first explored the area, we just didn't have climax forests. You know, that's where succession comes up to that point, to climax. But we've always had disturbances of our forest. And what that does is just, if you think about it, it just knocks around succession. So things like fires have always played a role in our forest, always in the East, and we still have them. You know, storms, hurricanes, or tornadoes will come through, and think about that climax forest, and it just kind of rips them all down, pushes that succession back. Floods, drought, insects and diseases, human influences of clearing the land. So we've always had disturbances within our forest to grow back. And so here's an example. This is just over the border in York County. It's a forest that was harvested. That's a disturbance. 60 years later, you know, the forest kind of reemerged from that. So there's always things to knock forest back and to kind of push it forward. So, you know, when I say, you know, Maryland is a forest, mostly, you know, just meaning we have the climate, we have the soils and the moisture for forests to be here. And, you know, when, you know, if you just stop mowing your lawn, eventually a forest is going to return to that. It may not be quickly, but eventually that will happen. So that's why it's a forest. It naturally will be a forest. When we mow our lawn, all we're doing is preventing a forest from emerging from it. And we maintain our grass, of course, but, you know, we're keeping that forest from reemerging. We're knocking things back. We're holding succession in a very, 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 very early state. So when we do things like a timber harvest, that's just a disturbance. We're essentially taking a forest and we're moving it back. We're moving succession back to an earlier state. Okay, especially let's say a clear cut. So you're going to knock it all the way back. And eventually those things, those woody species, those forbs, they'll start to emerge again. Things will blow in, things that have been dormant in the soil for a while, seeds will start to reemerge for a while as those trees start to grow back. So, timber harvest or cutting trees would be pushing succession back. The alternate is true as well. When you plant a tree, let's say in a field on your lawn, when you kind of reforest an area, you're pushing succession forward because you're not waiting for those annuals. You're not waiting for the forbs to come. You're not waiting for whatever seeds out there to take hold. You're essentially pushing succession forward, and you're designing what forest is going to exist because you're putting the species that you want to grow on your property. That'll be the next forest. So you're pushing succession forward a little bit when you plant. All right. So these are the last kind of series of slides. These are a great one. I show these a lot. But it kind of illustrates in a series of photographs what the succession is about, what this competition is all about. So this is a forest up in Northwest Pennsylvania in the Allegheny National Forest. We have here a few trees. You have sugar maples right here and black cherry. That's kind of what they're known for up there, the black cherries. But this forest didn't always look like that. This is 2008. This is 1928. So this was taken U.S. Forest Service, so they're taking photographs over the years. But you can see they harvested this forest. You can see this is kind of remnants of chemicals they were taking from, some of the bark. So they would do a harvest, and then they would come back and take some of the smaller stuff for what is called a chemical cut for the tannins that were in this wood. But essentially they clear this area. And you can see once they clear the area, you're allowing light then to reach the forest floor. You've eliminated that competition essentially for light. Now everybody has exposure to the light. And so the competition ensues from that. So immediately you have things growing on that property, especially when it was an existing forest. So you can see within the 10 years, you have thousands of trees per acre, all growing up, and they're competing for that light. So I want you to pay attention to the black cherries. Here are the black cherries right here. They're growing really well. They're a species that, they're shade intolerant, but they grow really well in that full sunlight. 10 years later, you can see those trees well. This is the sugar maple that are starting to grow. So you have a lot of black cherry and sugar maple, but you can see they're getting bigger. But those trees that were growing at the same time, one's bigger than the other. It means this one's probably has a bigger crown. So it's making more food, it's adding more energy, it's growing faster. So it's probably shading out the one right next to it. And you can see that 10 years later. It definitely is. This one's getting much bigger, even though they're the exact same age. The thing. So you're wondering, this one's probably shading this a little bit, but you also have trees like this alder tree right here that's probably shading it from this side. So if you can imagine, the crown of this tree is probably very, very tiny. Now look at this sugar maple. There's kind of two stems on it. And this often happens after a harvest. When you cut a tree, you have multiple stems coming out of the old stump. And they just grow into, two stem trees type of thing. But you can say, remember, sugar maples, they tolerate shade really well. They don't grow very fast. And so this is kind of just hanging out in the understory, kind of waiting for everyone to die. 10 years later, you can see sugar maples clearly in the understory now. This one hasn't gotten much bigger, but it's still surviving. Here's that alder tree. This is definitely, so this cherry is surpassing this one right here. So you can imagine its crown's much bigger. It's out competing this one. It's shading it out, so it's not growing well. But what happens this year? What happened to that alder tree? Look at that alder tree. Something happened to it. It broke. It's no longer competing. It's no longer taking sunlight from this tree right here, this black cherry. And you can see it's starting to respond to it. So as that competition is reduced around it, that tree can put out more branches. It can make more food. And if it makes more food, it's, it metabolizes that food and grows bigger. And so that happens right here because this competition is there. That sugar maple still just hanging there. It's okay. It grows slow in the shade. You can see by 88, it's really starting to catch up to this tree right here. This is just now a remnant, you know, of its former self, never kind of grew back. 98, you know, the sugar maple's starting to get bigger again, but this, you know, the trees are almost, you know, the same size now in diameter. And then 2008. And I looked around for the next 2018 picture. I couldn't find it anywhere. So I don't know what's going on. But one thing I do want you to notice is comparing on these two pictures. Now this was done should have been done at the same time of year, but what you notice here that wasn't in any of the other pictures. And this is a challenge. This is microstation. So Japanese stilt grass, if anyone has it on their property. So this is a national forest. So now this is a new thing that's added into this forest as a competitor, you know, not for these trees, but definitely for the next generation. So whatever seeds are starting to come up have to compete with this microstation here. So this is kind of an unknown invader at that time when they started to take these pictures. So this is kind of why we'll get into invasive plants. Because invasive plants are now putting a new element into our forest where we had predictability in our forest, but when we're adding new species in there and not really knowing how they're going to compete with our existing forest, you can see that. And now look at this, like this picture here. This is that microstation here, just carpeting that forest floor. So that kind of changes succession or how the ecology of our forest is working. Now, you can imagine, you know, again, these trees are fine. They're growing. This microstation is not going to affect them at all. But where is the young trees? You know, remember, it's fecundity is passing the genes to the next generation. There should be a new growth of seedlings in here. And they're not. They're being outcompeted by this microstation, which is very, very thick. Or Japanese barberry. This is another one. And you see this all over state parks too. But this was a landscaping plant that was brought into this country. We have American barberry, which I've never actually seen out in nature, but Japanese you see everywhere, and it grows in the understory. This really has ramifications for our next forests. And then, of course, we get into trees. So the invasive plants can come in really anything. You have, you know, your grasses, your shrubs, your trees, which this is tree of heaven, which is a very, very tough tree to deal with. They're allelopathic, so they can release toxins into the soils as well. They also reproduce by rhizome. So from their roots, they'll put out a root and they can put up a new shoot, which becomes a new tree. And they're a very difficult tree to actually control without the use of herbicide. You know, if you just cut this tree, it just makes it angry. Because remember, it's that fecundity. And what it'll do, it'll immediately put up 100 new trees from its roots because it's panicked. You know, it needs to survive to pass its genes on. So, you know, that could be a very, very difficult one to control. We'll talk about how to control a lot of these on Saturday, some examples out there. And then, of course, vines, which probably be the most detrimental to your existing forest of any of the invasives is, you know, vines like Oriental bittersweet. This one happens to be kudzu. I just put that in there because this is a house underneath this kudzu vine, which it does exist in Maryland. I have pictures of barns that are underneath kudzu over on the Eastern Shore. But vines can be bad. English ivy, porcelain berry. There's a whole slew of them that get into our forest that, you know, the problem is, you know, they can climb into trees, added extra weight to your trees. They can cover the top of trees. They, you know, essentially can kill your trees. So, but that changes the ecology of what you have to deal with. So it's definitely more challenging, I think, to deal with. But we'll, you know, talk about how we can kind of overcome it to put in some control measures. Maybe we're not going to eradicate stuff, but we'll help control things so we can accomplish our goals. Invasive insects are another one. And you know, I know Harford now is the epicenter of the spotted lanternfly. I mean, I remember writing an article about that, gosh, early 2010 maybe, about how it was in Pennsylvania and it would be coming down. But yeah, it definitely emerged in there. But it's not as bad as, I guess, you know, it's definitely not as bad as these ones here that we have. Like this one here, the emerald ash borer, that's literally wiped out ash trees in Maryland. You know, there definitely are still ash trees out there. But you know, this is one that was first found in Prince George's County back in like 2005 maybe, and has spread everywhere. So Eastern Shore, it's everywhere, and it's just wiped out a lot of our ash trees in our forests. Gypsy moth is another one that's affecting there. It's a non-native species that's wiped out a lot of different hardwoods. It defoliates them repeatedly, which eventually weakens the tree, where emerald ash borer will actually kill the tree by girdling it. You have hemlock woolly adelgid, which is another one for our hemlocks. They're the same one. They're sap suckers, so they'll essentially be taking the food from the tree, and the tree eventually will starve in different branches. And then this is a new one, and I don't think it's in Harford yet. I know it was in Cecil. This is a walnut twig beetle. And so what this one does is actually burrows into black walnut trees, but it delivers a fungus into that tree as well. That leads to a disease called thousand cankers disease. So you can see just, we have, non-native plants that are creating issues for landowners, but we also have insects that are a problem as well. Deer are a huge issue in the ecology of our forests. You may have issues on that in your property. You may not notice it, but if you walk into your woods, you don't see any understory, nothing on the ground. It's most likely too big of a deer herd. So we have an overabundance of deer, and they do wreak havoc on a lot of our forest land where there's just nothing growing in there because deer will eat anything they can. And you can see like this, the bottom right-hand corner, you can see this is a deer fence. This was a harvest that was conducted, this whole area. But you can see the great regeneration of trees that are coming after that harvest, where over here where they harvested, there's nothing, because anything new growing up, the deer have just decimated. This is a big one too. So it's called high grading harvesting. So we do promote sustainable forest management. So that includes timber harvest. We definitely support landowners who do timber harvests. As long as they do it under a forest plan and help and use a forester to help them, that's a great thing. It could be a good way to rejuvenate a forest, helps the landowner, make some income off the property as well. And, as long as it's done right, new forests reemerge. So, we definitely promote forest harvesting if that's what the landowner's wishes are. But there is a harvesting practice that's very unscrupulous. It's called high grading. And unfortunately, this still happens to our forests and degrades our forests. And this would be where, let's say, an unscrupulous logger or forester approaches a landowner and says, can we do, kind of look at your land and see how much your trees are worth? And they may come out and come back in and say, they look great. We'll do a harvest. We'll leave a lot of your trees, most of your trees. You won't even notice that. And then you'll have trees to harvest later. What ends up happening in a high grade is a logger will come in and take all the high value trees out of your forest. So everything that's of high value, both for wildlife, let's say like big oak trees, and then, high value to sell for timber as well. So when you cut all these, your dominant straight growing trees out of your forest, what you're left with are trees that didn't compete well in the first place. And a lot of the high value wildlife trees are often removed. So that's called high grade harvest. And unfortunately, that still happens. That's why we always promote that a landowner who's thinking about a harvest, they would hire their own forester to help them, to kind of be on their side, to help select what trees could be harvested, what's the best prescription for that property. And the last thing is kind of change the ecology of our forests as well, is the fire suppression. Not saying we need to go out and burn your forest, but fire has always been part of our landscape. It has always affected our forests. And one thing, it's always promoted oaks in our area because oaks tend to be thick bark. And we'd always have forest fires. Most often they were low grade fires. They would come through very quickly. But what they would do is, burn down some of the thin skinned trees, thin bark trees, I should say, and help kind of reduce that competition. They kind of open up more light, clear out the understory, and it favored oaks and hickories that had nice thick bark. But what's happening is we do put out fire, and we kind of need to with homes so close to a lot of our woodlands, is that allows trees like red maple, which is a totally fine tree. It's native to kind of dominate a lot of our forests because, red maples grow extremely well on the top of the mountain or down in our swamps. It grows extremely well. They have very thin bark, but what is happening is eventually maples are going to be more numerous than our oak trees. So they'll dominate. Once the oaks dies, it'll be replaced by, maples like red maples. So we're kind of changing the dynamics of a forest too with fire suppression. I'm not advocating go out and light your forest on fire, but people are doing that as a forest management thing. They're doing prescribed burns to help kind of regenerate the forest. Okay, so we've kind of come to the end of the ecological principles. I kind of did want to open it up to questions that you might have and see what we can address. But this is just kind of a reminder that, this is where we're going to be on Saturday to kind of, apply what's in the book, to kind of go through the property and learn a lot of things you can do on your own property. And we're going to focus on these 3 chapters here. So you might want to just to look over some of the activities with the books. It's chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5. Now, we're not going to cover everything in those short 3-hour period, but we'll kind of pull out a couple activities. We'll walk around the property and look at different things as if it were just a, private land that, we can start to, manage, get you some ideas of what you can do on your property. And I think that's all I had for this initial presentation, but I did want to open it up to any questions.
Thank you so much, Craig. That was absolutely fantastic. I learned so much from that, and I'm already thinking about my own property as well as those that the Harford Land Trust owns, how I can look at it in some new light with some of this information. So as Craig said, this is the time for questions. We do have plenty of time left. It is your choice if you want to type it in the chat. Jackie or I can read those off. If you are comfortable and know how to do it, you can feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question directly.
Could you just remind us what program you're from? And if I know property owners who are interested in trying to reforest parts of their property, could I point them towards you as a resource?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, which is a nonprofit organization, but we work a lot with, land trusts like Harford Land Trust, but, government agencies as well, like Maryland Forest Service. Yeah. And we can talk about this a lot on Saturday, but we actually have a reforestation program called Healthy Forests, Healthy Waters, which is a turnkey tree planting program where, it doesn't cost the landowner anything, but you can plant an acre or more. We've planted, well over 100 acres of new forest land in Harford County already over the last 7 years. So yeah, most certainly. And I'll have information on that program on Saturday, but we do have funding to do these projects. So it's great. Sure.
We have a question here from Linda Robertson. If cutting down a tree of heaven would cause even more baby trees, what is the best way a landowner can attack them? I have so many on the outskirts of my woods.
Yes, it's such a tough tree to kill. And, and the only way to kill a plant like that, things that reproduce by their rhizomes, so through their roots, when they root sucker, the only way to effectively kill them is to kill the root system. And so you wouldn't just rip the tree out because you're always going to leave fragments. The only really effective way to kill tree of heaven is through herbicide. You can use things like a glyphosate or a triclopyr, and we'll talk about that a little bit on Saturday. And I could demonstrate some techniques. We won't actually do it or spray herbicide, but I'll demonstrate some very simple techniques you can do to kill tree of heaven. It may take a couple treatments to do, but it's just a hatchet and a bottle of herbicide. You're just making cuts, and what you're doing is you're sending the herbicide down to the roots, which eventually kills the roots. And that's what you have to do with things like tree of heaven, is you have to kill that root system. And so it's almost impossible to do without the use of herbicide.
And Linda, I would also add that our Harford County Extension Service, that's part of the University of Maryland Extension Service that serves all landowners, whether it's woods or farmers, They are very helpful in terms of applications of things like herbicides as well. And so they're all based out of the Harford County Ag Center, and happy to provide that information as well.
Yeah, and I'll bring some information on invasive plants in there that has some resources on what you can use as well.
I was wondering if you have a methodology that kind of guarantees that the seedlings will grow. And if you have advice about what you need to have in place before you could do plant new trees.
Yeah, sure. And you know, that's a great thing. And we do, I mean, we're getting ready this spring to plant about 280 acres of new forest just in Maryland. So, you know, we do have a method, but what we're doing, like anything, is we're thinking about how a forest would emerge. And so, you know, a mature forest might have 100 like mature trees per acre. So, you know, we plant bare root seedlings, tiny 1 foot little trees. And we do protect them with tree shelters, but the idea is we have great success rate, and we're not expecting every tree to survive, but what we're doing is simulating a forest where a new forest would put up thousands of trees per acre. You know, we're planting at 300 trees per acre with the idea that eventually a lot of those trees in 100 years are going to die off. But we're planning on that with the idea that we want those trees to grow quickly, put out their crowns, their branches, and shade out everything. So yeah, I mean, we've been very successful to do it. A lot of that has to do with site preparation. So making sure before you plant the trees that you're controlling the stuff around it, and every site is differently. And then the key, and this is the most important key of tree planting, is, you know, planting the trees is easy. It's the maintenance of that tree planting for the first few years, because essentially you're putting the trees in the ground and you want those roots to establish, because once they establish, they'll put on that top growth. So maintenance, it's all about that competition and reducing competition for the trees. So what we do on our tree plantings is we'll plant the trees on private land, and then we keep a contractor to come back 3 times a year during that growing season to mow the property. So they'll mow along the rows of trees to keep the grass down so they're not competing. Oftentimes we'll spray herbicide around the tree shelter to keep that competition down. They'll straighten up shelters, and they do that for 3 years. And so by that time, after the end of that 3 years, those trees are pretty well established. They're, you know, we have some trees that'll be 15 feet tall after the end of that 3 years, those fast growing trees. But the key of it is preparing the site ahead of time and then maintenance afterwards.
So, I mean, are there grants available for the maintenance, or how does that work?
We do. So like in our program, the Healthy Forests, Healthy Waters, we get our grant money from the state, but we ask for our projects that they pay for the cost of the planting, the site prep, and the maintenance. So we pay for it all, because, you know, what we don't want to do is plant trees, walk away, and have them die. And that's what happened for years. A lot of organizations would come in, plant the trees, walk away, and they would just get out competed, you know, especially by things like, you know, with turf grass or you know, grass can take a lot of those nutrients in the soil moisture away. So we pay for maintenance within the grant, or we generally won't plant trees unless we know there's going to be maintenance. So just so we can keep those trees going.
Just for everyone's benefit, Brittany did ask if the participants should bring this book, The Woods in Your Backyard, that we sent all of you on Saturday. And yes, we do advise that. And I would say if anyone has not received theirs in the mail yet, please let us know. If you signed up late, just within the past 2 days, we weren't able to mail it to you so that it would arrive today. So we will bring extras for those people on Saturday.
Yeah, and so I would say even within that book, for what'll be really beneficial, where you get the most out of Saturday, is just to look through the first few activities. You might want to, you don't have to read the whole book, but it might help you to think about your property. And really, one of the biggest things for you is to have goals for your property. Like, what is it that you like about your property? If there's something you like the way it is now, the idea of the goal is, how do we want to maintain it so it's that way? You know, one thing about your land, it's ever changing. Okay, so, you know, if, you know, improving wildlife is your goal, you know, you would treat your property differently if it's, rather than if it's just privacy. I just need privacy on my land. And that's a legitimate goal as well. So think about what it is that you want from your land. And then you base your activities, anything you're going to do on your property, through that lens of your goal. So there are a couple activities to help you think about coming up with goals. So definitely have your goal when you come Saturday.
There's another question here from Brittany. She said the unmanaged forest woodland behind me is overgrown with invasives, especially poison ivy, and new to this season is porcelainberry. I'm worried that planting my yard will develop the same problem since it backs right up to this mess. Do you have any suggestions to plant and maintain a forest canopy on my property?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's an unfortunate issue, but this happens a lot too with different land ownerships. You know, the plants don't care who owns the land. You know, they don't care about those borders. And so this often is an issue when you're bordering up to a property that has those things. So that seed, especially if they're blown, they're coming in any property around. The key, I mean, one key would be to talk to your landowner. I know that's often difficult about what that issue. Most people don't realize when they see invasive plants that they're bad or why they're an issue. But once you do learn they're an issue, it can be overwhelming as well. On a planting, as long as you're kind of maintaining, you know, that site, invasive plants are always going to be an issue, I think, on our properties. To try to think that you're never going to have them or you're going to eradicate them is, you know, almost a fool's errand, because it's always going to be new things. And so just trying to control what would be there. So, you know, with porcelainberry, you know, it does reproduce by their berries, but also through the root system as well. So being able just to mow an area between your neighbor's property and your property, so that's not emerging, is like a good buffer that you can do. And then just the fact that you're aware that that's porcelainberry, I think, is half the battle. If you can catch invasives early in your property, you have a better option to control them. It's just when you find them and they're already established and the root system's huge that it's an issue.
And Craig, any thoughts on poison ivy? Obviously, that's a native plant.
It is.
But in many edge areas in particular, I know on my own property, and it sounds like this in the woods that backs up to Brittany, it can really just take over the understory, and the vines can be tremendous and even pull down some smaller trees.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, poison ivy. I'm no friend of poison ivy. I'm really, really allergic. Sometimes having to go to the doctors because I react so badly. Yeah, I mean, you can treat that like any other invasive, and we can talk about that on Saturday too. You can pull that stuff out, so they're not necessarily going to reproduce. I wouldn't advise it if you're allergic to it at all, but you know, that could be a simple, you know, foliar application of herbicide, and that's a safe way to do it, that you don't have to touch it. We'll talk about how to minimize use of herbicide to be most effective on that. But yeah, I mean, if you have uncontrolled growth of poison ivy, nobody wants that. So there's ways you can manage that. And luckily that's not as aggressive as some of these other invasive ones as well. So I think you can get a pretty good handle on control of that.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I was just going to ask Craig, is a copy of your PowerPoint presentation available? My wife and I do talks on bird habitat, and a number of these slides would be really useful to us in our presentation. So if that's available, I would appreciate a copy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we can send that out. I already created a link to it when I sent it to Kristen.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so that could be available to you, and you're welcome to have anything there. It's
good. Thank you very much.
We swap slides with everyone. I'm sure the slides I have, there's somebody else's too. So we share.
Yeah, and Greg, we did record this as well, so we'll be providing a link to this presentation. And you know, Greg, obviously we're big friends of the Harford Bird Club and they're big partners of ours. And so love to bring any of this material we can to the Bird Club or anyone else involved.
Absolutely, absolutely. Good, thank you.
Mhm. All right.
Okay, yeah, going once, going twice. Well, again, I just really want to thank Craig Highfield from the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay for this fantastic presentation. We're looking forward to seeing everybody on Saturday. Again, if you have any questions, you know how to reach Jackie or me at the Harford Land Trust. You will be receiving an email. And if you enjoyed this, please tell all of your friends about it. The registrations are still live for not only this workshop, but the others in the series. So please spread the word, and we look forward to seeing you on Saturday and at the next sessions as well. So enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you all soon.
Great. Thank you so much.